Hello students, today we will continue our study of the architecture of Le Corbusier and we will look at part 3. I had already discussed with you last time that a major shift started happening in the architecture of Le Corbusier. While in his early designs like Villa Savoye, he had followed the international style with wide planar geometry, clean lines, pilotis, an open plan, ribbon windows, etc. Very similar to all the other international style architectural works that were going on during that time. But post World War, with a lot of need for mass housing and other requirements of buildings because a major part of Europe had been destroyed, he needed another material and the material turned out to be raw concrete or Béton or Brut, which he had used in unite the habitation. I told you the reason: the consistent quality of construction could not be maintained in unite the habitation. So they just tried it by putting the concrete and just removing the shuttering and leaving it like that in the same form, and out of that a new aesthetic was formed or generated that came to be called as Béton Brut, the use of raw concrete, and that style came to be known, or the movement became known as Brutalism. So this I will be repeating again and again so to get the complete picture. We can say that the one major movement we have in the 20th century is modernism, and modernism has many subsets to it. Modernism in general talks about unornamented facades, rational build forms, open and free planning or open interiors, and very simple and smooth planar geometry, clean lines. And within that there is subset of the international style, which typically is what Villa Savoye is. Then there is brutalism, which you find in unite the habitation. Later on we will, for example, look at minimalism, which was what Mies van der Rohe had done. We will talk about functionalism, which is seen in the works of Walter Gropius in Bauhaus. So there will be many subsets of modernism that we will see. Following that, we will see how these subsets, then how modernism itself evolved into two major movements called late modernism and postmodernism, and they themselves had many subsets under them. We will talk about this in our presentation called Styles and Movements when we come to that. Coming back to this presentation, concrete gave Corbusier great sculptural freedom and it gave him very expressive forms. It was also imitated. This is an example which I had shared in my presentation on modern Indian architecture, showing how unite the habitation was so closely imitated by the Indian architect Shivnath Prasad in a building called the Akbar Hotel. Now Corbusier was also experimenting with abstract use of pure solids in his later phase. We find that in the Ronchamp Chapel, we find that in Monastery La Tourette, we find that in the buildings of Chandigarh like the Assembly Building. This shift from international style to brutalism was very clear and a complete shift that happened in his work. One of the reasons in India at least was because of the cultural and climatic context. Like in Chandigarh, there was a demand for a more grounded monumental architecture. There was a demand for an architecture which provided endothermal comfort. In his evolving vision, he now had more material honesty in the way he showed materials. It was a more regional response when we talk about his architecture in India, and somehow in buildings like Ronchamp Chapel and others, there is a poetic expression to his architecture now. Let's come to the chapel called the Notre Dame du Haut in Ronchamp in France, which he designed in which was completed in 1955. This building, this chapel, was embedded into the hilltop and the roof following the shape of the slope. It had open air spaces, and very interestingly, it had an exterior altar to accommodate the pilgrimage crowds, blending the built and the natural environment. Many of the terms that I am using, same terms can be used for other architects also of this period. For example, when I say he has embedded the building into the hilltop, kind of making the building off the hill, I am actually speaking the language of Frank Lloyd Wright. When I am saying that he is blending the built and the natural environment, I am again speaking the language of Frank Lloyd Wright. And this is one thing which I found very interesting as I study modern architecture, that some of the things these architects are talking about, their terms coincide with each other. their works overlap, their ideas overlap. And I still am a little puzzled how these architects, some working across the Atlantic like Wright and the European architects, or in Europe working in different countries, different regions, how they all aligned together in this movement called modernism. Now let's come to the dramatic shift that happened in Corbusier's work by comparing his brutalist Ronchamp Chapel with the international style Villa Savoye. So the differences I have listed out. In case of Ronchamp, it's a massive and sculptural form versus the machine-like planar geometry of Villa Savoye. Ronchamp is spiritual and quiet, Villa Savoye is open and functional. You find Ronchamp more like a cave, a more enclosed space. Ronchamp has thick curved walls, Villa Savoye has wide, planar and thin curtain walls. Ronchamp has rough and uneven surfaces, Villa Savoye has very smooth and fine finish. It's got a vast shell in Ronchamp of concrete roof. In Villa Savoye, it's a flat roof. There is natural light coming through small and scattered windows in Ronchamp, whereas there is this horizontal ribbon window, a part of his 5 points of a new architecture in the Villa Savoye. Now when we talk of material and texture in the Ronchamp Chapel, it's built out of rough whitewashed concrete, and because of the roughness of the white surfaces, they reflect the light unevenly, adding to a sense of depth in the building. The roof is made of sprayed concrete over a steel frame, and it's shaped like the hull of an upturned boat. If you look at the form and massing, it is asymmetrical, it is sculptural, it is a massive abstract sculpture rather than being a very traditional church building. The whole building itself turns into a sculpture, and it's got very thick curving walls, cave-like enclosure evoking that primitive sense of a sheltered space in the ancient or the prehistoric times. Now, this asymmetrical sculptural form or this massive abstract structure very interestingly appears in many of these standalone churches made by several architects. The Ronchamp Chapel by Le Corbusier in 1955, then this folded hand shape of the Unitarian Church by Frank Lloyd Wright in 47 to 51, then the first Unitarian Church in the US by Louis Kahn in 1962, and then we have this amazing Thorn Crown Chapel in the US by E.F. Jones in 1980. So these standalone church buildings, small church buildings, themselves became expressions of sculpture in architecture, or what you can call as sculpturalism. We may talk about it later when we talk about late modernism, where we will talk about sculptural expressionism and geometric expressionism. Now, asymmetric sculptural form with thick curving walls in the Ronchamp Chapel has the south wall. It curves outward and it is up to 12 feet thick. It is punctuated by these irregularly shaped windows that you see all over the facade, and they are set deep into the masonry. Light penetrates through them unevenly inside the building. Then you have this, if you watch very carefully, the roof is not kept on the walls. The roof is slightly lifted up, there are embedded columns in the wall, and the roof is floating, mounted on these columns, on these hidden columns. It's not touching the wall. Now, natural light is the central element of the beauty and sacredness that this space inspires. The light is through deep set stained glass windows that you see all over, of varying sizes and colors. So the light filters in a very mystical manner, and then it is enhanced by indirect light that is coming from 3 such light towers in the building. Like the previous churches I showed you as a sculptural form, there are other examples. There is the very famous example of the Church of Light in Japan by Tadao Ando and the Jubilee Church in Italy by Richard Meyer in 2003. And in both these buildings, my focus for giving these 2 case studies separately from the others is, this is about the kind of light that filters into these buildings. It is true for the earlier examples also, particularly the Unitarian Church by Frank Lloyd Wright, where light filters in an amazingly mystical way, a very interesting, very wonderful way into the building, and that has been compared with the earlier Unity Temple of Light, where light filtered in through skylights. You can refer back to my presentation on Frank Lloyd Wright to look at that case study. So here, for example, the Church of Light has this cross shape through which the light filters in, and here the light filters in through this massive skylight in Richard Myers Church. This importance of inner light in religion is very important, and this points spiritually to the seeking of the inner light. That is why in all these church buildings, the one I showed you earlier, these ones, though I am not, except for this one, we don't see the interior of the others, but they also have this amazing play of light, and also in the Ronchamp Chapel, and here we find, and also here, the play of light in these three churches. This is by Louis Kahn, this is the Unitarian Church by Wright, and this is the Ronchamp Chapel. The play of light is very important within the church building. Now this is the outdoor altar and worship area that Le Corbusier created in the Ronchamp Chapel. So when people participate in the worship service, they are actually standing on the hillock, with the hillock in the with the landscape in the background of them, and so it's outdoor. And then there is one of his most famous works, Monastery La Tourette in France in 1960. This is also a brutalist work, a building that he designed for the monks of the Catholic order. It sits on a slope which is raised on a pilotis, and it lets the building hover over the natural hillside. It's very different from the Ronchamp Chapel, where the Ronchamp Chapel was embedded into the hillside. Here it floats over the hillside, standing on the pilotis. This building also has simple geometric forms lifted on the pilotis, very unlike the Ronchamp Chapel in form. It's a very, what you call a cuboidal form, primarily cuboidal geometric shape. The cells of the monks are small, identical and stacked rhythmically. There is a lot of order and simplicity, and the rooms themselves are very narrow and very simply furnished. Now there is also this play of pure geometric forms that he started doing in the later phase of his life. We find here in Monastery La Tourette the use of pure geometry like pyramids or triangular shapes, other forms we find all over in Monastery La Tourette. And there is also the use of sunbreakers or Brise-Soleil. Brise-Soleil essentially means sunbreaker. So there are these sunbreakers which are more like boxcrete louvers, and then there are these vertical louvers. But the interesting thing about these vertical louvers is that they are not placed at equal distance from each other. There seems to be a harmonic rhythm in it. They draw closer to each other, then go apart, and then draw closer again. Now this is based on the modular scale. If you look at the modular scale here, there is this drawing nearer and then going apart. So he continues to follow the modular rhythm in these vertical Brise-Soleil or sunbreakers. And this is not the only building where he will do it. He will do it in other buildings also. This is in Monastery La Tourette, the interiors, how the light penetrates inside the building, and this became one of the important aspects of his architecture, how light defines the interior space, how light shows the interior space. And this is true for nearly all great architects of the 20th or even earlier centuries, the way they used light to light up the interiors. Now one of the strongest influences on post-independence Indian architecture was the work of Le Corbusier. You know very famously that he designed the city of Chandigarh, and he did some projects in Ahmedabad also. He is the one Western architect of the 20th century who has made the biggest impression of young modern Indian architects. Now this shift towards brutalism, towards the use of raw concrete, actually turned out to be a blessing in disguise for us in India, because this brought him to a phase where he was using more rugged sculptural forms, where he was juxtaposing pure forms like cylinders and cones and cubes, and this was helpful because Indian building technology was not so advanced, manual labor work was done, The finish of the building could not be so neat and tidy as it was possible in what you for example would say in the West, like in Villa Savoye. So the use of raw concrete turned out to be the right material choice for the conditions in India. At the time of his coming to India, his work had already shifted from the earlier geometric simplicity of the international style to brutalism. So the impact. Compositional ideas that he brought to India were framed long before he came to India. For example, in buildings like United Habitation. And he learned from India the texture and richness of concrete could be exploited sculpturally in the hand of these low-skilled workers. He took advantage of this and turned what would have been a very big constraint, a very big lacune into a very big positive aesthetic, very interesting and a very novel aesthetic that had a global reach. Now the works also showed universal solutions for many of the concerns of modern architecture. So what do we have? If we look at, say, the Shodhan house that he did, it is basically a combination of Béton Brut or rough cast concrete along with the 5 points of a new architecture that he have evolved earlier. So you find in Villa Shodhan the Pilotis, the free plan, the free facade, the extensive use of openings instead of ribbon windows, and you find that the entire building is out of, it's a brutalist building. So he has combined the first and second phase of his architecture in these works. Now you find free flowing interiors in RCC frame continuously in his projects, starting say from the earlier Citroën in 1922. This is not his building, but it reflects the same idea of the free flowing plan with an RCC frame. Shader House by G.T. Ritwell, there is Villa Savoye, and then we find that in the Villa Shodhan in 1954, which is unlike Villa Savoye, Shader House, Citroën, which was in white planar geometry. This is brutalist. So Villa Savoye in tropical setting, in brutalist style, but a much more complex section is what Villa Shodhan is, or Shodhan House is. Now he was hired in 1950 along with his cousin Jean-Pierre Jeanneret and the couple Maxwell Fry and Jane Drew to design Chandigarh. He worked both in Chandigarh and Ahmedabad and added a whole new dimension to the Indian architectural experience. He designed, for example, the Capitol complex, the centerpiece of Chandigarh, and in this he designed several buildings. The buildings designed here were all done by Corbusier, like the Assembly building, the High Court building, the Secretariat building, the Monument of Martyrs, the Open Hand, the Tower of Shadows, and one unbuilt building, the Governor's Palace. Now some say that the derivation of the Capitol complex is from Mughal architecture. There is close links between the overall site layout of the Capitol complex with the broken symmetry and the hierarchy of spaces that we find in Fatehpur Sikri. The Capitol complex is also compared with Rajpath as a contrast. Rajpath had a very strong central axial symmetry, whereas Capitol complex Chandigarh has a very big plaza. There is also a derivation again from Mughal architecture in which the assembly building in Chandigarh is compared or related to the Hall of Public Audience in Red Fort in Delhi in the way the building has been put together. Now there is in the assembly building Pilotis like in Villa Savoye, and there is also Béton Brut or raw concrete in interior and exterior as you find in United Habitation. So both Villa Savoye, the Pilotis you find here in the assembly building, and the Béton Brut of the United Habitation you find in the assembly building. Now assembly building has classical symmetry, very strong axial symmetry, and we find that also in the new National Gallery made in the 1950s by Mies van der Rohe in Berlin. We have it in the Alte Museum made in the 19th century by Carl Friedrich Schinkel. We find that in the Crown Hall in IIT Illinois by Mies van der Rohe, and of course we find it in classical architecture itself in the Parthenon. Now, one very interesting thing about the modernist architects was, in Europe particularly, was their use of classical geometry, proportion, harmony, all these principles from classical architecture in their buildings. Repeatedly you find them using these principles in their architecture. So here we have the elevation of the assembly building with the massive part of these geometrical forms. This frustum that you find here, this frustum is opening up into the assembly hall beneath. This would have been a skylight that brings in light from above. Unfortunately, it has been closed now. Now these 5 points of a new architecture are also evident in the buildings of Chandigarh. There is the Pilotis. Not only is this a Pilotis, watch very carefully, this is also a flat Pilotis, very thin flat Pilotis that has been used, and other points like the free plan. When you look within the plan, the free facade because of the massive punctures, and instead of ribbon windows you have the Brise-Soleil now because of the climatic conditions of India. And these are the interiors of the assembly building, and you find reinforced the idea of Béton, Brut, raw concrete finish. Similarly, we find the same thing in the High Court building in Chandigarh, in the Secretariat building in Chandigarh. If you want to study these buildings in more detail, please refer to my earlier recordings of modern Indian architecture. Now, Corbusier's influence in many Indian buildings were he completed in 1960 and 1980. During this period, the buildings that were built in India, like Unity Habitation for example, led to him designing the Secretariat building, which led to the design of even IIT Delhi by J.K. Chaudhary from 1961 to 1984. The unbuilt Governor's Palace has been compared with the Diwan-e-Khas of Fatehpur Sikri, and there is no doubt about it that Corbusier himself was influenced by the works of the Mughal architects. In the plaza there are other built forms, like I told you, the Tower of Shadows, the Open Hand. They are here at the very corner on this side. You see the Monument of the Martyrs. And then there are the sculptural forms, not only in Chandigarh, this is in the assembly building, but also in Unity Habitation and in Monastery La Tourette. So this became another thing in which he started expressing himself very boldly in these massive sculptural forms in his building. Then the play of light and shadow within the Tower of Shadows and also in the Ronchamp Chapel. There were other features that he began using: the dramatic roof forms, bold sculptural forms, Brise-Soleil, exposed raw concrete as a major building material. There were solids and voids in his work. There was this interpenetration of spaces and the freestanding staircase. There was shadow and light. Features like rainwater spouts, which other modern Indian architects started using. There were the balusters, there were the ramps, and this components became celebrated features. So we can again, if we recollect the features of Corbusier's work, there is of course Brutalism, there is Pilotis. Repeatedly if we find in Chandigarh and other buildings primary colors, we find ramp, we find pure geometry. These are the sketches of Le Corbusier, and these sketches indicate one very fantastic thing, is how wonderfully he was able to perceive how the built form would look in the landscape in Chandigarh. When it was completely unbuilt, it was a completely exposed, open, flat terrain. How he conceived that the Governor's Palace would look, or the Open Hand would look in that vast terrain, how it would fit there, is the amazing thing about the sketches of Le Corbusier. So we'll end here and we'll then continue to our last presentation of Le Corbusier. Thank you.